Welcome back, everyone. You guys have been sending in some really interesting stuff about all these mysterious drone sightings over New Jersey.
Yeah, it's been pretty crazy.
There was a CNBC News report that caught my eye, and a really interesting Reddit thread with all sorts of theories.
Uh-huh.
So we figured it's time for a deep dive.
A deep dive indeed. We've got hundreds of reports coming in since mid-November,
Wow.
mostly from New Jersey describing these objects, flying around at night.
So are these like those little drones you see kids playing with in the park?
Not exactly.
Okay.
A lot of witnesses are saying these things are much bigger
Hmm.
than your typical hobbyist drone, which definitely adds to the mystery.
I can only imagine.
And get this, some of these sightings have been reported over places like Trump's Bedminster golf course and even a military research facility.
Whoa, hold on. So we've got these huge, unidentified flying objects lurking around strategic locations in the dark.
Yep.
I can definitely see why people are freaking out a little.
Yeah. Well, it's understandable, right? When you come across something you don't recognize, especially in kind of a creepy setting, your mind naturally tries to fill in the blanks.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
So are we talking like a serious national security threat here? Like a whole fleet of spy drones sent by some foreign power? Or is there something else going on?
Well, that's where things take an even more interesting turn.
Oh.
The FBI and the Department of Homeland Security have been looking into all this, and they've come to a pretty surprising conclusion.
Are they going to say it's aliens?
Not quite, but close.
Okay, on the edge of my seat.
What they've found is that a lot of these so-called drone sightings are actually just people mistaking normal airplanes for drones.
Wait, what? You're saying people can't tell the difference between a plane and a drone, especially at night?
It might sound crazy, but it's actually way more common than you think.
Really?
Yeah, think about it. Our brains are wired to look for patterns and explanations,
Okay.
even when we don't have all the information.
Right.
So when you see lights moving across the sky at night, especially with all the talk about drones these days, it's easy to jump to conclusions.
So you're saying our brains are kind of playing tricks on us?
In a way, yeah. It's like if you're walking in the woods at dusk
Okay.
and you see something moving in the shadows,
Right.
your heart starts pounding. You think it's a bear or something,
Yeah, for sure.
but then you get closer and it's just a harmless deer.
I see your point. So it's all about how our expectations and maybe our fears can shape what we see.
Exactly. And this gets even more complicated in the age of social media.
Oh, yeah, because then everyone's sharing their theories and videos and...
Exactly. It all spreads so fast, whether it's true or not.
Well, speaking of social media, let's talk about that Reddit thread you mentioned.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
I bet it's full of all kinds of crazy misinterpretations and conspiracy theories.
It does not disappoint.
What have you got?
People are mistaking things like wind farms for alien spaceships,
No way.
planets for drones, even parts of buildings for secret government bases.
Wow. It's amazing how easy it is to be fooled.
It's a classic case of what psychologists call confirmation bias.
Confirmation bias.
Yeah, we tend to look for information that supports what we already believe.
Makes sense.
So if you already think the government's hiding something or aliens are visiting Earth, you're more likely to see any weird thing as proof.
Even if there's a simpler explanation.
Exactly.
But even with the FBI saying it's mostly misidentified planes, some people are still convinced something fishy is going on, right?
Oh, definitely. Even the CNBC article mentions Mike Waltz.
Isn't he Trump's pick for a national security advisor?
Yeah, and he's expressed worries about where these drones could be coming from and what they're doing.
What does he think is happening?
He even suggested we might need something like the Iron Dome.
Wait, the Iron Dome, that's Israel's missile defense system.
Yeah, he's basically saying these unidentified objects, whether they're drones or just planes, are a serious threat.
Like on the level of a missile attack.
Pretty much. So on one hand, we've got the FBI saying it's probably just misidentification.
Yeah.
And on the other, we've got someone high up in national security worried about foreign enemies.
It's like two totally different stories.
It is, and that brings up a really important question. How do we make sense of all this information when it comes to something as serious as national security?
That's a great question, and one we're going to tackle head on as we continue our deep dive. But first, let's break down the arguments from both sides,
Sounds good.
starting with the conspiracy theories.
All right, so they're pointing to incidents like airport shutdowns caused by drone reports
Makes sense.
as evidence that there's something bigger going on that the authorities are trying to downplay or even hide completely.
So they're saying if it's just planes being mistaken for drones, then why are airports being shut down?
Exactly.
That is a good point. But what about the people who think it's mass hysteria? What are they saying?
They're focusing on how social media can blow things out of proportion.
Yeah, that definitely happens.
They argue that even if the first reports are wrong, they can trigger a chain reaction.
Like people seeing drones everywhere because they're expecting to see them.
Exactly. And a lot of the videos online are from phones without sound, so you might not hear the engines of a plane, making it easier to think it's a drone.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so we've got these two camps, both with their own evidence and explanations.
Yep.
It's like we're in a hall of mirrors where it's hard to tell what's real and what's not.
That's a good way to put it.
How do we even begin to sort through all of this?
Well, that's where things get really interesting.
Okay, I'm ready for it.
And that's what we're going to explore next.
Sounds like a plan. Let's dive into the psychology behind all this.
All right.
And figure out how our own biases and perceptions can affect how we see this whole drone mystery.
Let's do it. You know, this whole drone thing, it really makes you think about something.
What's that?
How do we figure out what's true and what's not these days?
Yeah, with all the information coming at us all the time.
It's like drinking from a fire hose.
Exactly, it's overwhelming.
And it's not just the amount of information, it's the speed.
Yeah, and how everything's like sensationalized.
Headlines are crazy. The language is supercharged.
Uh-huh. It's like everything's an opinion now.
It makes it hard to know what to believe.
So how do we stay grounded? How do we develop that, like, critical thinking you were talking about?
Well, first, we got to admit that we all have biases.
Oh.
We come to every situation with our own beliefs and experiences.
Sure.
And that stuff can affect how we see things, even if we don't realize it.
So let's say I'm someone who believes in, like, government conspiracies. What should I be careful of?
You got to watch out for sources that use a lot of anonymous people.
Okay.
Or claims that haven't been checked out. Look for evidence from multiple places that you know are trustworthy.
So not just some random website I find.
Exactly. And think about the bigger picture. Does this new information make sense with what we already know about the world?
Right.
Or is it based on like leaps of faith?
That's a good point. It's easy to focus on one thing and not see the whole picture. But what if I'm the opposite? What if I'm super skeptical? Like, I don't believe anything unless I see it with my own eyes.
Well, then you got to be careful about dismissing something just because it's new or different.
Okay.
Being skeptical is good, but we also have to be open to the possibility that we might be wrong sometimes.
So it's all about finding that balance.
Exactly. Between healthy skepticism and, being humble.
Like admitting we don't know everything.
Exactly. And being willing to change our minds if there's good reason to.
That's not easy.
It's not, but it's how we grow.
So how do we apply all this to the drones?
Let's go back to those airport shutdowns. The conspiracy folks are using those as proof of a cover-up.
Yeah.
A critical thinker would say, okay, those shutdowns are a big deal. But they wouldn't automatically assume it's a conspiracy.
They'd look for other explanations.
Right, like maybe the authorities are just being super careful because of the risks drones pose to planes.
Even if those risks are overblown?
Exactly. And we've seen airport shutdowns because of drones before.
In other countries.
Yeah, and a lot of times it was just someone being reckless or mistaking something for a drone.
Not some big government plot.
Right.
So we got to compare this to other situations.
And see if the evidence really supports the crazier idea.
Makes sense. What about the mass hysteria explanation? How would a critical thinker approach that?
They would acknowledge that social media can twist things.
Yeah.
But they wouldn't just dismiss every report as fake.
So they dig deeper.
Right. Look for details, corroborating stories, maybe even get an expert to look at the videos online.
Okay.
And don't forget the psychology.
Right, like confirmation bias.
And how we see patterns even when they're not there.
And how fear and uncertainty can mess with our perceptions.
Exactly.
It's like we're all detectives trying to figure out what really happened.
That's a great way to think about it.
But we have to be careful and objective and follow the evidence even if it leads us somewhere unexpected.
That's the key.
So it's not about just believing or disbelieving everything. We have to think critically.
Engage with the information.
Be skeptical, but also curious.
You got it. And that's super important these days with so much information flying around.
You mentioned Mike Waltz comparing this to the Iron Dome.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder if there's a deeper fear here.
Of what?
Of these new technologies. Drones are pretty new. They can go places and do things we haven't seen before.
I see what you mean.
It's like we're not sure how to deal with them.
The Iron Dome is all about protection.
Right, like keeping a country safe from a real threat.
By bringing that up, Waltz is tapping into a basic fear.
The fear of the unknown.
and of things we can't control.
Then that kind of fear can be manipulated, can't it?
Especially when information spreads so quickly and it's hard to tell what's true.
So we need those critical thinking skills more than ever.
To protect ourselves from misinformation and from being misled.
So with all these drone sightings and theories and everything,
What have we learned?
what are the key takeaways for our listeners?
The big one is that we all have a part to play in fighting misinformation.
Right.
We have to be aware of our own biases, check the evidence carefully, and even be willing to question our own beliefs.
So it's not just about this drone thing,
It's about being curious and skeptical and engaged in the world.
not just passively taking in whatever we see.
Exactly. And that's a skill that will help you in all areas of life.
Great point. So how do we wrap this up? What's the final thought you want to leave our listeners with? So we've talked about misidentified planes and conspiracy theories.
Even how new technology can make people anxious.
But, even with all the signs pointing to just regular planes, there's still a part of me that kind of likes the idea of a drone mystery,
I get it. There's something exciting about not knowing.
about the possibility of something bigger happening that we don't understand,
It's like that feeling that makes us explore new things and try to solve puzzles.
to figure out answers to questions we've always had.
Exactly. And even if, in this case, the answer is probably pretty normal,
Right?
the process of thinking about it and looking at the evidence and being critical, that's still really important.
So instead of saying this drone thing is over,
Yeah.
we can use it to get better at thinking critically
And become smarter about the information we see.
and be more aware of how our own minds can trick us.
Exactly.
I like that.
The truth about these drones might stay a mystery,
Yeah.
but the important thing is that we thought about it and investigated it.
And learned how to form our own opinions.
That's what matters.
So as we wrap up this deep dive,
What's the big takeaway?
what should our listeners keep in mind when they hear stories like this in the future?
I think the most important thing is to be skeptical, but also curious
Okay.
and humble. Don't just believe everything you hear.
Right.
Ask questions. Look at the evidence from different angles and be open to changing your mind.
It's about remembering that the world is complicated,
Yeah.
and simple answers aren't always easy to find.
Especially when people are scared and uncertain.
And remember, critical thinking isn't just about proving conspiracies wrong
It's about being open to new ideas.
and accepting that things are usually more complex than they seem.
That's a great way to put it.
This deep dive has been as much about looking inward as looking at the world around us.
I think you're right.
Maybe the most interesting mysteries are the ones inside our own minds
How we see things.
and the stories we tell ourselves about what's real and what's not.
That's a really interesting thought.
Well, that about wraps it up for this deep dive.
Thanks for joining us.
Keep those critical thinking skills sharp, and don't be afraid to question things.
And remember, the truth is out there, but the search is just as important as the finding.
We'll be back next week with more sources and more deep dives.
See you then.
Thanks for listening, everyone.